There are mistakes in life that disappear with time. Bad days, bad decisions, moments we regret, yet somehow recover from. But then, there are other choices, the kind that quietly divide life into two versions, before the decision and after it. One moment, one impulse, one choice that changes everything. This is one of those stories. It begins with hunger, not war, not betrayal, not violence, just hunger, and ordinary feeling, the kind every human being understands. A man exhausted, tired, empty, desperate for relief. And somehow, that ordinary moment became one of the most tragic decisions in biblical history. His name was Esau, the firstborn son of Isaac, grandson of Abraham, a hunter, strong, rugged, wild, the kind of man people admired from a distance, the kind of man who looked powerful. But sometimes, the strongest people lose battles nobody else can see. And Esau's greatest battle was not outside him, it was inside him. Because according to the ancient story, Esau once traded away his future for a bowl of stew. Think about that. Not gold, not power, not survival, not a kingdom. A meal. One temporary relief. One moment of weakness. And suddenly, everything changed. At first, the story sounds almost ridiculous. Impossible even. Who would trade something priceless? For food? Who would exchange a future? For something temporary? Who could make a decision that's short-sighted? But perhaps that question becomes uncomfortable very quickly. Because maybe human beings still do this every day. Trading long-term peace for short-term comfort. Trading health for temporary pleasure. Trading relationships for pride. Trading dreams for distractions. Trading futures for moments that disappear almost immediately. And perhaps that is why Esau still matters. Because deep down, many people understand what it feels like to regret something, a moment of emotion, a reckless choice, a decision made while tired, angry, lonely, hungry, desperate, and afterward, the painful realization, why did I do that? Because here is something human beings rarely like admitting. Some of life's biggest mistakes happen in moments of emotional weakness. Not because people are evil, not because they are stupid, but because exhaustion changes judgment. Pain changes perspective. Desperation narrows vision. And perhaps that is exactly what happened to Esau. Imagine him returning home, tired, empty, body aching from the hunt. The kind of hunger that makes thinking difficult. The kind of exhaustion that makes relief feel more important than consequences. And there, waiting for him, stood his brother, Jacob, quiet, calculating, watching, cooking stew. The smell rising through the air, comfort, warmth, relief. And perhaps that was the moment everything changed. Because sometimes, life-changing decisions arrive disguised as ordinary moments. No warning, no dramatic sign, no voice from heaven saying, "Be careful." Only hunger, emotion, pressure, and one dangerous thought. He need relief right now. Then came the offer. Simple, almost absurd. Jacob would give him food in exchange for his birthright. Now, pause there. Because modern people often misunderstand what that meant. This was not a small trade. This was enormous. The birthright meant inheritance, status, leadership, legacy, future. The blessing of the firstborn, identity, everything. And somehow, Esau looked at all of that and said, yes, why? Why would anyone do that? Was he foolish, emotionally impulsive, neglected, desperate, or was something deeper happening inside him? Because perhaps Esau's story is not really about food. Perhaps it is about pain. The pain of feeling unseen, misunderstood, emotionally neglected. The burden of growing up in a divided family. Because Isaac favored Esau, Rebekah favored Jacob. Love divided, attention divided, identity divided. And maybe that matters more than people realize, because sometimes people stop valuing themselves long before they make destructive choices. Sometimes the decision that ruins everything began years earlier, inside wounds no one noticed. And perhaps that is why Esau feels strangely modern, because many people understand emotional impulsiveness, the feeling of reaching for comfort, because something deeper hurts. Comfort eating, self-sabotage, anger, addiction, escapism, temporary relief replacing long-term wisdom, and, afterward, regret, heavy, painful, lasting. Because Esau's story did not end with stew, that would have been easy. No, the consequences came later, slowly, painfully, when he realized what had actually been lost, a blessing stolen, a future changed, a brother gone, a family broken. And perhaps that is the cruelest thing about regret. Sometimes you only understand the cost after the moment has already passed, after emotion fades, after appetite disappears, after the temporary thing no longer matters. And suddenly, you are left asking, was it worth it? Because maybe that is the question Esau still whispers across thousands of years. What are you trading for something temporary? Peace, health, purpose, relationships, identity, a future version of yourself. And perhaps that question feels uncomfortable because deep down, many people already know the answer. We all have moments where temporary comfort feels more important than tomorrow. Moments when emotion grows louder than wisdom. Moments when pain convinces us nothing matters except relief. And maybe that is where tragedy quietly begins. But before we judge Esau too quickly, before we call him reckless, before we decide whether he was victim or fool, we must go back to the family he was born into. A family already divided, a home already fractured, a childhood shaped by favoritism. Because perhaps Esau's story did not begin with stew. Perhaps it began much earlier, inside a family where two brothers learned something dangerous. Love was never equal. Before we can understand Esau's decision, before we can understand the bowl of stew, the lost blessing, the regret, and the anger that followed, we must first understand the family he was born into, because no story begins at the moment everything falls apart. The most painful decisions often begin long before anyone notices. Inside homes, inside silence, inside invisible wounds. And Esau was born into a family already carrying complexity, a family carrying promises, but also fractures, faith, but also favoritism, love, but also division. To understand Esau, we must first go back to Isaac, the quiet son, the boy who almost died on a mountain, the child of Abraham's impossible promise, and perhaps a man who quietly carried emotional weight long after childhood ended. Isaac eventually married Rebekah, a love story surprisingly tender for the ancient world. The biblical text says Isaac loved her deeply, something unusual in many ancient narratives. And for a while, perhaps, life felt hopeful. But hope in this family rarely arrived easily. Because just like Abraham and Sarah before them, Isaac and Rebekah struggled with infertility. Years passed. No children. Waiting returned. The same painful waiting Abraham once knew. And eventually, after prayer, something changed. Rebecca became pregnant. But the pregnancy felt strange, painful, complicated. The story says something unsettling happened. The children struggled within her, not after birth. Before birth, conflict had already begun. Imagine that, two brothers fighting, before even seeing the world. And according to the story, Rebecca sought understanding. She asked why the struggle felt so violent. The answer she received sounded almost prophetic. Two nations are within you. Two peoples will be divided. The older will serve the younger. Pause there, because perhaps division began before either boy even had a choice. Expectation entered the family early. Prophecy entered the family early. And maybe comparison quietly entered too. Eventually, the twins were born. Esau first, then Jacob. And immediately, difference shaped everything. Esau came first, hairy, strong, wild. A child who looked rugged from birth. Jacob followed, holding Esau's heel. An image so symbolic, people remembered it forever. One brother arriving first, the other already reaching, already holding on, already somehow competing. And perhaps competition quietly entered the family before either child understood it. The boys grew, and quickly, differences became identities. Esau became the hunter, strong, outdoors, independent. The kind of son fathers often admired in the ancient world. A provider, masculine, capable, comfortable in wilderness. Jacob, very different, quiet, thoughtful, closer to home. The Bible describes him as dwelling among tents, less rugged, more reflective, different. Neither wrong, simply different. But here, the story becomes painfully human, because parents made a dangerous mistake. The text says, Isaac loved Esau, Rebekah loved Jacob. Read that again. Not equally, not together, divided. Each parent favoring one child. And perhaps this is where the real tragedy begins. Because modern psychology understands something ancient families often ignored. Favoritism wounds children deeply. Even subtle favoritism shapes identity. One child becomes the successful one. Another becomes the difficult one. One feels chosen. Another feels overlooked. One learns confidence. Another learns insecurity. Children notice, always, even when adults think they do not. Imagine growing up in Esau's home, feeling your father's approval, yet sensing your mother leaning toward your brother. Imagine Jacob, loved by his mother, but watching Isaac favor Esau, competition quietly forming, resentment slowly growing, love beginning to feel conditional. Because perhaps the deepest wound in divided families is this. Children begin competing for belonging, and competition inside families becomes dangerous, because eventually, identity becomes fragile. Children stop asking, "Who am I?" and begin asking, "Who do I have to become to be loved?" And maybe that question shaped both brothers more than anyone realized. Think about Esau for a moment. The favored son of Isaac, strong, respected, expected to inherit leadership. The firstborn in the ancient world. This mattered enormously. Modern people sometimes miss the significance of being firstborn. But historically, birthright was everything. Inheritance, status, authority, leadership over family, a double portion of blessing, future security, identity itself. Esau did not merely have privilege. He had destiny, or at least, everyone assumed he did. Yet perhaps, something complicated happened underneath the surface. Because privilege does not automatically create emotional security. Sometimes, the child who looks strongest carries invisible loneliness, especially inside divided homes. Imagine growing up, loved for what you represent: strength, skill, masculinity, expectation. What happens when identity becomes performance? What happens if weakness feels dangerous? What happens if emotional needs stay hidden? Perhaps that matters more than we realize. Because people who feel emotionally unseen often seek immediate comfort, temporary relief, quick satisfaction. Not because they are weak, but because something deeper feels empty. And maybe that possibility changes how we understand Esau later. Because impulsive decisions rarely begin suddenly. They often grow quietly inside unmet emotional needs. Still, Jacob carried wounds too, feeling second, feeling overlooked by Isaac, learning early that direct competition might never work, and perhaps that shaped him differently. More strategic, more calculating, more manipulative, because children adapt to environments. The strong child survives one way. The overlooked child survives another. And suddenly, the rivalry between brothers feels painfully believable, not evil. Human, complicated. Family systems often create roles without realizing it. The achiever, the rebel, the caretaker, the forgotten child, the golden child, the overlooked one. And sometimes, those roles shape lives for decades. Perhaps Esau became the strong one. Jacob became the clever one. Neither fully free, both trapped in expectations. And maybe that is why the story still resonates. Because many people understand divided families. Parents unintentionally choosing sides. Siblings quietly competing. Love becoming comparison. Attention becoming uneven. And children learning dangerous lessons. Love must be earned. Someone else is preferred. There is not enough approval for everyone. Those beliefs follow people into adulthood, into relationships, into identity, into self-worth. And perhaps the bowl of stew begins making more sense now, because maybe Esau's decision was not merely hunger. Maybe exhaustion uncovered something deeper. Maybe a boy raised in division became a man struggling to value what he truly had. And perhaps that feels painfully modern. Because many people today sabotage futures not because they are foolish, but because somewhere inside, they quietly stopped believing they deserved better. Still, before we judge anyone too quickly, we must remember something important. No, family in Genesis feels simple. Abraham's family carried wounds. Isaac's family carried wounds. And now, those wounds quietly move into another generation. Because family pain rarely disappears on its own. It travels. Favoritism becomes rivalry. Silence becomes misunderstanding. Unhealed wounds become future conflict. And somewhere inside that divided home, two brothers kept growing. One strong, one clever, one impulsive, one patient, both carrying invisible needs, neither fully understanding that one ordinary afternoon. A single bowl of stew would change everything, because tragedy rarely announces itself dramatically. Sometimes, it enters quietly, disguised as exhaustion, disguised as hunger, disguised as one small choice, made inside a heart already carrying more pain than anyone noticed. There are moments in life that feel ordinary until much later, moments so small, so forgettable, that no one realizes they are standing inside a turning point. No thunder, no warning, no dramatic voice announcing, "Be careful." Only exhaustion, emotion, a simple decision, And somehow, an entire future changes. Perhaps that is what makes Esau's story so haunting, because it begins on an ordinary day. The kind of day no one expects to remember forever. Imagine the wilderness, dry land stretching endlessly, dust clinging to skin, heat pressing heavily against the body. The hunt had lasted long, longer than expected, and Esau, he was exhausted, not the ordinary kind of tired, the kind of tired that changes judgment, the kind of hunger that narrows thinking, the kind that makes long-term consequences suddenly feel irrelevant. Modern psychology understands something ancient people lived daily. Exhaustion changes decisions. When people feel depleted, emotion grows louder than wisdom. Relief becomes urgent. And perhaps that matters more than we realize, because life-changing mistakes often happen when people are emotionally empty. And maybe that afternoon, Esau was emptier than anyone knew. Imagine him walking home, body aching, mind exhausted, stomach burning with hunger. The hunt unsuccessful, perhaps. The frustration of effort without reward. The loneliness of wilderness. The quiet pressure of being the strong son. The expected son. The firstborn. The one people assumed had everything figured out. And perhaps, deep inside, something already felt heavy, because strong people often carry struggles invisibly. Then he smelled it. Food. Warm. Comforting. Immediate. The smell cutting through exhaustion like relief itself. Stew. Simple. Ordinary. Yet somehow dangerous. Because sitting nearby, calmly, was Jacob, his brother, different in every way, quiet, patient, observant, cooking, waiting, and perhaps watching more carefully than Esau realized. Imagine the scene. Esau entering exhausted, Jacob stirring the pot, the smell filling the air, warmth, comfort, temporary peace, and suddenly, nothing feels more important than relief. Esau spoke first. The ancient text records something strangely desperate. Give me some of that red stew. Pause there, because desperation changes people. When people feel depleted, they stop thinking long-term. They stop protecting futures. They stop valuing things properly. Everything becomes immediate. Now, relief, escape, comfort, and maybe many people understand that feeling. The kind of emotional exhaustion where consequences stop mattering. The moment where people say, just need something right now. Food, comfort, validation, pleasure, distraction. Anything easing pain temporarily. And perhaps that is where tragedy quietly begins. Jacob looked at him, and then came the offer. Simple, cold, calculated. Sell me your birthright first. Imagine the silence after that sentence. At first, perhaps it sounded ridiculous, almost laughable. A birthright for stew. Impossible. Surely nobody would agree to that. But remember, Esau was exhausted, emotionally depleted, hungry. And hunger narrows vision. Pain shortens perspective. The future disappears. Only immediate relief remains. Esau answered, I am about to die. What good is the birthright to me? Think about that. One sentence. And perhaps everything inside it feels painfully human. Because people often exaggerate when overwhelmed. Everything feels catastrophic. Everything feels urgent. Temporary discomfort suddenly feels unbearable. And perhaps that sentence reveals something deeper. Esau was not thinking about tomorrow. Only survival. Only relief. Only ending discomfort. Modern psychology has a word for this. Short-term emotional thinking. The tendency to sacrifice long-term well-being for immediate emotional relief. And suddenly, Esau feels strangely modern, because human beings still do this constantly, trading futures for temporary comfort, health for cravings, relationships for pride, dreams for distractions, meaning for relief, and, afterward, regret, heavy, painful, permanent. Still, Jacob pushed further. Swear it. Not joking, not symbolic. Real, binding, permanent. And somehow, Esau agreed. Just like that, the firstborn blessing, future inheritance, leadership, identity, legacy, everything traded for a bowl of stew. The text says Jacob gave bread and stew. Esau ate, drank, then stood up and left. One sentence follows that feels painfully quiet. Thus Esau despised his birthright. Imagine that moment. Meal finished, hunger gone, temporary relief fading, life moving forward, and perhaps Esau still did not fully understand what had happened. Because regret often arrives slowly. Consequences rarely appear immediately. That is what makes destructive decisions dangerous. Temporary choices often feel harmless at first. No pain yet, no visible consequence. Only later, the cost appears, and perhaps that afternoon ended quietly. Jacob satisfied, Esau relieved, life continuing, yet unseen. Something had shifted forever. Because some losses happen before people realize they are losing anything. Days passed, maybe months, maybe years, and somewhere, the story kept moving, until another moment arrived, the blessing. Shishak old, weak, blind, preparing to pass the family blessing, a sacred moment, the future finally becoming official. Esau must have felt certainty. After all, he was still firstborn, still the hunter, still the chosen son of Isaac. Surely, everything would unfold naturally, except life rarely forgets earlier decisions. And while Esau prepared, Jacob moved. Rebekah intervened. Disguise, manipulation, deception. The blessing stolen, the future redirected. Imagine Esau returning, expecting inheritance, expecting recognition, expecting identity, only to hear the impossible truth. The blessing was already gone. The text records something heartbreaking. Esau cried out, not quietly, not calmly, a loud, bitter, broken cry. The kind of cry people make when regret finally arrives. Imagine the pain, the confusion, the disbelief. Bless me too, Father. But suddenly, everything changed. And perhaps that is the cruel thing about some decisions. You cannot always reverse them. You cannot always undo what emotion once destroyed. And perhaps, for the first time, Esau understood. The stew no longer mattered. The hunger was gone. Temporary relief, forgotten. But consequences remained. Forever. And perhaps that is why his story still hurts. Because many people understand delayed regret, the relationship ruined in anger, the opportunity abandoned too quickly, the addiction chosen for comfort, the dream traded for distraction, the moment of weakness that felt small, until later, when clarity finally arrived, and suddenly, people whisper to themselves, why did I do that? Why did not I think longer? Why did temporary pain convince me permanent loss was worth it? Because perhaps Esau's tragedy was never really about stew. The stew only revealed something already happening inside him. Impulsiveness, emotional exhaustion, a divided family, invisible wounds, the inability to see future value while overwhelmed by present pain. And honestly, that feels painfully modern. Because maybe Many people are still standing where Esau once stood, emotionally hungry, tired, lonely, desperate, one temporary comfort away from sacrificing something meaningful. And perhaps that is why this story survives. Not because of ancient inheritance laws, not because of brothers fighting, but because every generation eventually faces the same terrifying question. What am I trading away for something that will not even matter tomorrow? Because tragedy rarely arrives dramatically. Sometimes it smells warm, feels comforting, promises relief, and quietly asks, "Are you sure this future still matters?" And perhaps the most dangerous decisions in life are the ones that feel harmless in the moment. And now, we arrive at the question that has divided readers, historians, theologians, and ordinary people for thousands of years. Was Esau a victim? Or was he responsible for his own downfall? Because honestly, few biblical stories feel this emotionally complicated. At first glance, the answer seems obvious. Esau lost everything: his birthright, his blessing, his future, his position, and somehow his own brother walked away with it all. Surely, that sounds like betrayal. But the deeper you look, the harder certainty becomes, because Esau's story lives in uncomfortable territory, the place where human weakness, family dysfunction, bad decisions, and betrayal all collide at once. And perhaps that is exactly why people still argue about him. Let us begin with the obvious question. Did Jacob betray Esau? The answer seems simple. Yes, at least partially. Jacob absolutely manipulated the situation. Think about it. Esau came home exhausted, hungry, emotionally vulnerable. And Jacob, he saw an opportunity. Instead of compassion, he negotiated. Instead of helping, he leveraged weakness. Sell me your birthright first. Imagine someone exhausted, emotionally depleted, desperate for relief, and another person using that moment for advantage. Modern people would call that manipulation, predatory behavior, exploitation. And perhaps that makes many readers uncomfortable, because Jacob, later remembered as a patriarch, does not look heroic here. He looks calculating, cold, patient, strategic, almost disturbingly strategic. And then, later, came the blessing incident, the deception. Jacob disguising himself as Esau, Rebekah helping, Shishak blind and vulnerable, an elaborate lie unfolding inside the family. And suddenly, many readers ask, how could Esau not be the victim? After all, he was deceived, manipulated, tricked by both brother and mother. That feels deeply unfair. And honestly, perhaps it was unfair, because family betrayal cuts deeply, especially betrayal inside homes already divided. Many people listening probably understand that pain too. Sibling rivalry, favoritism, parents choosing sides, feeling overlooked, feeling replaced, feeling like someone else quietly received what should have been yours. And maybe that is why Esau resonates emotionally, because loss feels personal, especially when family is involved. Still, the story refuses to stay simple, because there is another uncomfortable truth, one many readers struggle to ignore. Esau made choices too, and perhaps that matters, because long before Jacob stole the blessing, Esau had already traded away the birthright himself. Voluntarily, nobody forced him. Nobody tricked him into saying yes. Hungry, yes. Exhausted, absolutely. Emotionally vulnerable, probably, but still, he chose. The ancient text says something striking. Esau despised his birthright. That sentence matters, because it suggests something deeper than hunger, something internal. Not merely exhaustion, but undervaluing. Perhaps Esau simply did not understand what he carried. And honestly, that feels painfully human, because people often undervalue important things until they are gone. Health, trust, marriage, time, opportunity, peace, identity. People neglect things quietly, assuming they will always remain available, until suddenly they do not. And perhaps that is why some readers believe Esau bears responsibility, not because he deserved betrayal, but because he treated something valuable casually. There is another fascinating layer too, the psychology of impulse. Modern psychology sees something incredibly relevant inside Esau's story. Impulsivity, the tendency to prioritize immediate relief over future reward. This is deeply human. Researchers call it delayed gratification failure, the inability to tolerate temporary discomfort for greater long-term outcomes. Children struggle with it. Adults struggle with it too. Think about modern life. Debt for temporary pleasure, addiction for temporary escape, comfort eating, scrolling endlessly, abandoning dreams when progress feels slow. Human beings repeatedly sacrifice tomorrow for relief today. And perhaps Esau becomes one of history's oldest psychological mirrors. A man trapped inside the emotional urgency of the moment, the future suddenly feeling abstract, the present pain suddenly feeling unbearable. And maybe many people listening understand that feeling, not because they sold a birthright, but because they have made choices while emotionally exhausted, angry, lonely, desperate, sad, fearful. And afterward, regret arrived, heavy, slow, painfully honest. Still, there is another uncomfortable question. Did family dysfunction create the conditions for collapse? Because perhaps Esau's story did not begin with stew. Maybe it began much earlier. Inside childhood, inside favoritism, inside emotional division. Remember, Isaac loved Esau. Rebekah loved Jacob. Already, the family split. Imagine growing up inside that, competing for approval, watching unequal affection, feeling comparison constantly. Children adapt to family systems, sometimes beautifully, sometimes painfully. Perhaps Jacob learned he must outsmart to survive. Perhaps Esau learned it. Strength matters more than reflection. And perhaps both brothers carried wounds. That matters, because psychology repeatedly shows people make poorer decisions when emotional needs go unmet. Emotional neglect changes judgment. Loneliness changes judgment. Feeling unseen changes judgment. Sometimes, destructive decisions begin long before the actual moment arrives. And perhaps that makes Esau's story harder to judge. Because what if he was not foolish, only emotionally underdeveloped? What if impulsiveness grew from invisible pain? What if the divided family quietly shaped both brothers more than anyone realized? And suddenly, the question becomes much harder. Not who was wrong, but how did everyone contribute to the tragedy? Because maybe this story has no pure villain. Jacob manipulated, Rebekah deceived, Isaac favored, Esau acted impulsively. Everyone played a role. And honestly, that feels painfully realistic. Because family breakdown rarely belongs to one person alone. It forms slowly, quietly, through patterns, silence, favoritism, miscommunication, unspoken resentment, and eventually, everything breaks. Still, there is another historical layer. Some historians argue the Esau-Jacob conflict symbolized something larger, not merely brothers, but nations. Esau became associated with Edom, Jacob with Israel. The rivalry between brothers may reflect later political tensions between peoples. In this interpretation, the story becomes national memory, an explanation for conflict, a symbolic narrative about competing identities. And honestly, that possibility fascinates historians, because ancient stories often carried layered meaning: personal, political, spiritual, psychological, all at once. Still, let me offer something personal. Not certainty, only perspective. If you ask me, was Esau victim or responsible? I think the answer is painfully complicated. I think he was betrayed, and I think he made destructive choices. Both things can be true, because life rarely fits neat categories. People can suffer injustice and still make mistakes. People can be wounded and still hold responsibility. People can be victims without being powerless, and perhaps that is what makes Esau feel so tragically human. He was not evil, not stupid, not hopeless, just human, tired, emotional, impulsive, carrying invisible wounds, making one terrible decision, whose cost he only understood later. And perhaps that is why his story still survives, because many people quietly fear the same thing. What if one bad decision changes everything? What if I already traded something valuable before realizing what it was worth? Because maybe the hardest part of regret is not losing something. The hardest part is finally understanding its value after it is already gone. And perhaps that is the question Esau still leaves hanging in history. When life breaks apart, how much was fate and how much was choice? Now, let us step away from Esau for a moment. Forget the wilderness, forget the stew, forget the ancient family drama, and ask a question that feels painfully modern. Why do people still trade their future for temporary relief? Because if we are honest, Esau's story feels uncomfortably familiar. Not because most people have siblings stealing blessings, not because anyone is literally trading birthrights, but because almost everyone knows what it feels like to want relief right now, to feel overwhelmed, exhausted, emotionally hungry. And suddenly, the future stops feeling important. Only comfort matters. Only escape matters. Only relief matters. And perhaps that is where tragedy quietly begins. Because maybe human beings have not changed as much as we like to believe. Technology changed. Culture changed. Life accelerated. But human psychology, still fragile, still emotional, still vulnerable to moments of weakness. And perhaps that is why Esau still matters. Because modern people build their own bowls of stew every day. Different forms, same temptation, something temporary, offered in exchange for something meaningful. Think about it. How many people sacrifice health for comfort, late-night habits, stress eating, ignoring exhaustion, neglecting bodies for temporary pleasure? At first, it feels harmless. One choice, one skipped effort, one moment of relief. Until years pass and consequences quietly arrive. Or relationships. How many people trade long-term trust for temporary emotion, anger, pride, attention? An affair? A cruel message sent during frustration. The moment feels satisfying, briefly. Then afterward, damage remains. Trust fractures. Regret enters, and suddenly, people whisper, "Why did I throw away something important for something that barely lasted?" And perhaps that question feels painfully familiar, because regret usually arrives after emotion fades, not during. During emotion, everything feels justified, urgent, necessary. The present pain feels louder than future consequences. That was Esau, and perhaps that is us too. Modern psychology understands something important. Human beings are terrible at imagining future pain, especially when emotionally overwhelmed. Scientists even have a phrase for this: present bias, the tendency to prioritize immediate comfort, while undervaluing future outcomes. And suddenly, Esau feels astonishingly modern, because maybe many people are living inside present bias right now, scrolling instead of building meaningful goals, temporary dopamine replacing long-term fulfillment, comfort replacing discipline, escape replacing healing. And perhaps the hardest part is this: most destructive choices feel reasonable in the moment. Nobody wakes up saying, "Today I will sabotage my future." No, people say, "I'm tired. I deserve relief. Just this once. We'll deal with consequences later." And later always arrives. Because perhaps that is what makes Esau's story so painful. He was not evil. He was overwhelmed. And overwhelmed people often make expensive decisions. Think about addiction for a moment. Alcohol, drugs, pornography, social media, shopping, workaholism, comfort behaviors. Most addictions begin the same way: pain, stress, loneliness, emotional hunger. Something hurts, something feels empty, and relief appears. Temporary, easy, comforting. The problem: temporary relief often charges long-term interest. The pain leaves briefly, then returns larger, stronger, and slowly. People realize the thing helping me cope is quietly hurting me too. Esau understood that feeling long before psychology had words for it, because stew solved hunger. For an hour, the consequences, a lifetime. And perhaps that is why modern people should not judge him too quickly, because everyone has a version of stew. For some, it is comfort eating. For others, toxic relationships, escapism, overworking, avoidance, procrastination, temporary validation, impulse spending, endless distraction. The details change. The psychology remains. Something temporary offered in exchange for something valuable. And perhaps that becomes dangerous in modern culture. Because today, temporary relief has become easier than ever. Phones offer distraction instantly. Food arrives instantly. Entertainment instantly. Validation instantly. Attention instantly. Relief instantly. Modern life constantly whispers, "Why tolerate discomfort? Escape it." And perhaps that is the hidden crisis of our generation. People increasingly lose the ability to tolerate discomfort. Boredom feels unbearable. Loneliness feels unbearable. Waiting feels unbearable. Failure feels unbearable. But growth often requires discomfort. Healing requires discomfort. Discipline requires discomfort. Meaning requires discomfort. And perhaps that is what Esau could not tolerate in the moment. Temporary discomfort. Hunger. Emotional depletion. The inability to pause. And perhaps many people today struggle with the same thing. Then there is another uncomfortable truth. Sometimes people trade their future not because they are weak, but because they secretly stopped believing they deserve something better. That feels painful, but important. Think about self-sabotage. People destroying opportunities, leaving good relationships, avoiding success, giving up too quickly, choosing temporary comfort repeatedly. Sometimes the deeper issue is not laziness. Sometimes it is identity, deep down. Some people quietly believe, good things are not really for me. I protect a future I cannot imagine? And perhaps that possibility changes how we understand Esau, because people who value themselves protect futures. People who feel emotionally empty often struggle to delay gratification. And honestly, many modern people know that feeling. Burnout, stress, loneliness, comparison, exhaustion, life becoming survival. And suddenly, temporary comfort feels more important than tomorrow. That is why mental health matters. That is why emotional awareness matters, because hurting people often make expensive decisions. Still, before this becomes hopeless, there is something deeply hopeful hidden inside Esau's story too. Awareness. Because the first step toward wisdom is recognizing the pattern. Asking difficult questions. What am I reaching for when life feels hard? What temporary relief keeps costing me something meaningful? What future am I quietly trading away? Because perhaps everyone stands in Esau's kitchen sometimes, tired, emotionally hungry, one impulsive choice away from regret. The question is not, will temptation come? It always comes. The question becomes, will I pause long enough to remember what matters? And perhaps that is where maturity begins. Not perfection. Awareness. The ability to sit with discomfort without immediately escaping it. The ability to say, this feeling is temporary. This urge will pass. My future matters more than this moment. Because temporary feelings lie. Hunger feels permanent. Loneliness feels permanent. Failure feels permanent. Pain feels permanent. But feelings shift. Consequences last longer. And perhaps that is Esau's greatest warning. Not simply, do not make bad decisions, but something deeper. Do not let temporary pain convince you that permanent loss is worth the price. Because maybe the most dangerous choices in life, you're the ones made while emotionally starving. And perhaps the question Esau still quietly asks humanity is this: what are you trading away today for something you may not even care about tomorrow? Because sometimes the future disappears slowly, one comforting decision at a time. And so, after the hunger, after the stew, after the betrayal, after the regret, we arrive at the end of Esau's story. Or perhaps not the end, because some stories never truly end. Some stories survive because they quietly follow every generation. And perhaps that is why Esau still matters. Not because people argue about ancient inheritance laws, not because everyone studies biblical history, but because deep down, many people know what regret feels like. The moment after emotion fades, the silence after a bad decision, the painful realization, he should have thought longer. Why did I do that? How did something so small cost me something so important? And maybe that is where Esau still speaks to humanity. Because his story is not really about stew. The stew disappeared quickly. The hunger disappeared quickly. The relief disappeared quickly. What remained was consequence. And, perhaps, that is where the first lesson begins. Lesson 1. Temporary feelings can create permanent consequences. This may be Esau's greatest warning. Human beings often make permanent decisions inside temporary emotions. Anger, loneliness, fear, exhaustion, desperation, shame, hunger. In those moments, everything feels urgent. The pain feels endless. Relief feels necessary. And suddenly, future consequences stop feeling real. But feelings shift. Consequences stay. One angry sentence can destroy trust. One impulsive choice can damage years of effort. One careless moment can reshape identity. And perhaps many people listening understand this already. Because almost everyone has experienced regret. The relationship ruined in emotion. The opportunity abandoned too quickly. The health neglected. The dream given up. The moment comfort felt more important than tomorrow. And afterward, clarity finally arrived. Too late. Perhaps that is why maturity matters. Not because mature people never feel emotion, but because mature people learn something difficult. Feelings are real, but feelings are not always wise. And perhaps Esau warns us, do not let temporary pain convince you to permanently sabotage yourself. But Esau teaches something else too, something deeply uncomfortable. Lesson 2. What we repeatedly choose quietly becomes identity. Imagine Esau after the stew. Life continued. The moment passed. Yet slowly, something changed. Identity shifted. He became the brother who lost the blessing, the brother remembered for impulsiveness, the brother history never stopped debating. And perhaps that feels unfair, because no one wants to be defined by their worst moment. Still, life works this way sometimes. Choices shape identity. Not instantly, gradually, quietly. Repeated patterns become character. Repeated reactions become personality. Repeated escapes become lifestyle. And perhaps modern people underestimate this. People think identity appears suddenly, but identity often forms through small, repeated decisions. Discipline, avoidance, integrity, dishonesty, kindness, bitterness, healing, self-destruction. Everything repeated eventually becomes familiar, and familiar eventually feels like self, which means the small choices matter more than people realize, because perhaps people are becoming someone through every decision. The question becomes, who? And maybe Esau quietly warns us, be careful what patterns you normalize, because repeated temporary relief can quietly rewrite identity. Still, there is another painful truth hidden inside Esau's story. Lesson 3. Regret often teaches value too late. Perhaps the cruelest thing about regret is timing. People usually understand value after loss, after trust breaks, after health fades, after opportunities disappear, after people leave, after consequences arrive. That was Esau. The birthright felt meaningless until it was gone. Then suddenly, he understood. And, honestly, that feels painfully human. How often do people take things for granted? Parents, time, peace, friendship, marriage, purpose, health, faith, potential. Many people only recognize blessings when absence teaches value. And perhaps that is one reason Esau still hurts, because regret feels universal. Everyone carries moments whispering, if only I had slowed down, if only I had appreciated it sooner, if only I had thought longer. And perhaps that is why wisdom matters. Wisdom means valuing things before loss teaches their importance. But Esau leaves another warning too, one modern culture desperately needs. Lesson 4. Emotional hunger is dangerous. Think about it. Esau did not make his decision while calm, centered, rested, emotionally secure. He made it depleted, hungry, exhausted. And modern psychology understands this deeply. People make worse decisions when emotionally starving. Burnout changes judgment. Loneliness changes judgment. Stress changes judgment. Emotional emptiness changes judgment. And perhaps that matters more than people realize, because many destructive choices happen during depletion. People sabotage relationships while lonely, overspend while anxious, overeat while stressed, quit too early while discouraged, choose comfort while overwhelmed. Not because they are weak, because they are depleted. And perhaps one of the most important forms of wisdom is this: never make life-changing decisions while emotionally starving. Pause, rest, recover. Think again, because temporary pain distorts perspective. Esau teaches us exhaustion lies, emotion exaggerates, urgency misleads, and maybe that reminder matters deeply today. But Esau teaches something hopeful too, something many people desperately need. Lesson 5. One bad decision does not have to define a life. This part matters, because many people hear stories like Esau and quietly fear, what if I already ruined everything? What if my mistake defines me forever? But human beings are more complicated than one moment. Yes, decisions matter, consequences matter, regret matters, but stories continue. People grow, heal, change, learn, and perhaps that is important, because shame traps people. Shame whispers, "You are your worst decision," but growth says something different. You are also what you choose next. Did Esau lose something valuable? Yes. Did pain shape him? Absolutely. But even after betrayal, he survived, adapted, built, life continued. And perhaps that matters for people carrying regret today. Because regret can become wisdom. If people stop running from it, pain can teach, loss can teach, mistakes can teach. But only if people become honest enough to ask, what was I truly hungry for? Because perhaps the stew was never really about hunger. Perhaps it was loneliness, exhaustion, pain, emotional emptiness. And maybe many people today are feeding symptoms while ignoring deeper wounds. And finally, Esau leaves us with one final lesson, perhaps the deepest one of all. Lesson 6. The life we want often requires sacrificing immediate comfort. This may be one of the hardest truths about adulthood. The future costs something. Discipline costs comfort. Healing costs honesty. Love costs vulnerability. Growth costs familiarity. Meaning costs patience. And perhaps that is why many people struggle, because temporary relief feels easier than long-term discipline. The gym tomorrow, healing later, dreams someday, boundaries eventually. But eventually, life quietly asks, what matters more? The comfort of today, or the life you hope exists tomorrow? And perhaps that is Esau's deepest warning. Do not trade tomorrow's meaning for today's craving, because cravings fade, consequences linger. And now, after thousands of years, Esau leaves us with one final question, a painful one, a deeply personal one. What are you treating as temporary? That may actually shape the rest of your life, your habits, your relationships, your health, your identity, your future. Because maybe the most dangerous decisions are not dramatic. Maybe they happen quietly, when nobody notices, when emotions feel loud, when relief feels urgent. And maybe Esau still whispers one warning across history. Be careful what you trade away when you're hungry for something temporary, because sometimes the future disappears, one impulsive decision at a time.